Margaret wiped the sweat from her forehead as she climbed the stairs to Mr. Harrison's bedroom. At 62, these daily trips up and down the grand staircase of the Harrison mansion were becoming harder on her knees, but she never complained. 20 years of caring for the wealthy businessman had taught her that consistency was everything. She knocked gently on the heavy oak door before entering. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison. Time for your medication." James Harrison sat propped up against his silk pillows, his once powerful frame now frail and dependent. At 85, the man who had built a shipping empire worth millions could barely lift a glass of water without help. His gray eyes, though dimmed by age, still held the sharp intelligence that had made him a fortune. "Margaret," he said with a weak smile, "what would I do without you?" She had heard this question countless times over the years, but it never felt routine. Margaret had started working for the Harrison family when James was still running his company, and his wife Eleanor was alive. Back then she was just the housekeeper, responsible for keeping the 15-room mansion spotless and preparing meals for the couple's dinner parties. Everything changed when Eleanor died 10 years ago. James, devastated by the loss of his wife of 50 years, began to withdraw from the world. His health started declining, and gradually, Margaret's role evolved from housekeeper to caregiver, nurse, and companion all rolled into one. She measured out his morning pills, 7 different medications for his heart, blood pressure, and arthritis. "Here you go, sir. Dr. Peterson said these new heart pills might make you feel a bit tired for the first few days." James took the pills one by one, his hands shaking slightly. "Margaret, I've been thinking. You've given me 20 years of your life. You could have had a family, traveled, done so many things instead of taking care of an old man." Margaret adjusted his blankets and opened the curtains to let in the morning sunlight. The garden outside was in full bloom, something she rarely had time to appreciate fully. "Mr. Harrison, this is my family. You and Mrs. Eleanor were the closest thing to family I ever had." It was true. Margaret had never married, never had children of her own. Her parents had died when she was young, and she had no siblings. When she started working for the Harrisons at 42, she had already accepted that her life would be different from most women her age. The Harrisons had welcomed her warmly, treated her with respect, and over the years the professional relationship had deepened into something resembling family. "But what about David?" James asked, referring to his son. "He should be the one taking care of me. Instead, he visits once a month and spends the whole time asking about the will." Margaret had met David Harrison many times over the years. He was a successful lawyer in his 50s, married with 2 teenage children, living in a different state. His visits to his father were cordial but distant. Margaret could see the disappointment in James's eyes each time David would cut his visits short or seem more interested in his inheritance than his father's well-being. "Your son has his own life, Mr. Harrison. He cares about you in his own way." Margaret had become skilled at diplomacy over the years, never speaking ill of David even when his behavior hurt his father. James reached out and took her hand with his trembling fingers. "Promise me something, Margaret. When I'm gone, don't let David forget that you were the one who truly took care of me. You deserve to be recognized for your devotion." These conversations about death and legacy had become more frequent lately. Margaret always tried to redirect them, but she could see that James was preparing for the end. His doctor had been honest. At 85, with multiple health conditions, James likely had months rather than years left. "Let's not talk about such things today," Margaret said gently. Mrs. Chen from the grocery store called. She said the strawberries you love are finally in season. "Should I pick some up this afternoon?"
James smiled, allowing the subject to change.
"Yes, and maybe some of those little cakes from the bakery. We could have tea in the garden if the weather holds." Margaret spent the rest of the morning helping James with his physical therapy exercises, preparing his special diet lunch, and managing his correspondence. She had learned to handle many aspects of his business affairs over the years, as his eyesight had deteriorated and his energy had waned. In the afternoon, they sat in the garden as planned. James dozed in his wheelchair, while Margaret tended to the roses Eleanor had planted years ago. She had taken over the garden, care when the professional gardener became too expensive, another cost-cutting measure, as James's income from investments had decreased while his medical expenses increased. As the sun began to set, Margaret helped James back inside and prepared his dinner. While he ate slowly in the dining room, she sat nearby reading him articles from the newspaper. This had become their evening routine: dinner, news, and then she would help him to bed. "Margaret," James said as she was clearing his dinner dishes, "I want you to know that these have been the best 20 years of my life, even with all the sickness and sadness. Your kindness has been a gift." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes but smiled instead. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison, that means everything to me." As she helped him prepare for bed that night, Margaret reflected on how much her life had changed since she first walked through the front door of the Harrison mansion. She had given up the possibility of her own family, her own home, her own dreams, but in return she had found purpose, stability, and something like love in this grand house with this kind old man. She had no idea that within a few months, everything would change and a phone call from David Harrison would alter the course of her life forever. For now she was simply grateful for another day of caring for the man who had become the center of her world. 3 months later, Margaret noticed the changes in Mr. Harrison were becoming more dramatic. His appetite had diminished significantly, and he spent most days sleeping in his chair by the window. Dr. Peterson's visits had increased to twice a week, and the conversations between the doctor and Margaret had grown more serious. "His heart is getting weaker," Dr. Peterson explained quietly in the hallway after examining James. "We're looking at weeks, maybe a month at most. Have you contacted his son?" Margaret nodded. She had called David 2 weeks ago to update him on his father's declining condition. David had promised to visit soon but hadn't set a specific date. Margaret understood that accepting a parent's mortality was difficult, but she also felt frustrated by David's continued absence during these crucial final weeks. James had good days and bad days. On good days, he would ask Margaret to wheel him around the house, pointing out photographs and telling stories about his life with Eleanor. He would reminisce about building his business, about the early years when money was tight but their love was strong. On bad days, he could barely stay awake long enough to take his medications. During one of his more alert afternoons, James called Margaret to his study. The room was lined with leather-bound books and filled with memorabilia from his business career. Ship models sat on shelves, and framed photographs of cargo vessels bearing the Harrison shipping logo covered one wall. "Sit down, Margaret," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. His voice was weak but determined. "I need to tell you something important." Margaret sat down, noticing how small and fragile James looked behind the massive mahogany desk, where he had once commanded a business empire. "I've been working with my lawyer. Not David, but the family attorney, Mr. Westbrook. I've made some changes to my will." James paused, breathing heavily from the effort of speaking. "You've been more than an employee, Margaret. You've been my daughter in every way that matters." Margaret felt her heart racing. "Mr. Harrison, you don't need to—" He held up a shaky hand to stop her. "Yes, I do. David will inherit the house and the majority of my estate as is proper. But I've set aside a substantial sum for you, enough to buy your own home, to live comfortably for the rest of your life. You've earned it." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. In 20 years of caring for James, she had never expected anything beyond her modest salary. She had savings, but not enough to retire comfortably. The idea that she might have financial security after James was gone felt overwhelming. "There's more," James continued. "I've written a letter explaining everything you've done for me, all the sacrifices you've made. I want David to understand that this wasn't a whim or favoritism. It was recognition of genuine love and devotion." Margaret reached across the desk and took his hand. "Mr. Harrison, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet. But promise me that when the time comes, you won't let David make you feel guilty about accepting what you've earned. You deserve every penny." That evening, Margaret prepared James's dinner with extra care, making his favorite soup and ensuring his tea was exactly the right temperature. As she helped him eat, she noticed he was struggling more than usual. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the spoon, and he seemed confused about where he was. "Eleanor?" he said suddenly, looking at Margaret with unfocused eyes. "Eleanor, is that you?" Margaret's heart broke a little. This had been happening more frequently, James confusing her with his late wife or forgetting where he was. "It's Margaret, Mr. Harrison. I'm here to take care of you." James blinked several times and clarity returned to his eyes. "Of course. I'm sorry, Margaret. Sometimes the past feels more real than the present." She helped him to bed earlier than usual that night. As she was adjusting his pillows, James grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. Margaret, if something happens to me, if I can't speak for myself, remember what I told you today. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve what I've left you. You've been the best part of my final years." That night, Margaret lay in her small room on the second floor staring at the ceiling. She had been so focused on caring for James day by day that she hadn't really considered what would happen after he was gone. The house would belong to David, and presumably he would sell it or move in with his own family. Either way, there would be no place for an elderly housekeeper. The thought of James's generous provision filled her with gratitude but also anxiety. Would David accept his father's decision? Would there be legal challenges? Margaret had heard stories of family members contesting wills when they felt outsiders had received too much. 2 days later, Margaret woke to find James unconscious in his bed. She immediately called Dr. Peterson and then, with trembling fingers, dialed David's number. This time he answered immediately. "David, this is Margaret. You need to come now. Your father is very ill." "How ill?" David's voice was sharp with sudden attention. "The doctor is here. He's unconscious. Dr. Peterson thinks it could be the end." There was silence on the other end of the line, then David's voice, strained but controlled. "I'll catch the next flight. I'll be there by tonight." Margaret spent the day sitting beside James's bed, holding his hand and talking to him even though he couldn't respond. Dr. Peterson came and went, adjusting medications and checking vital signs, but there was little he could do except make James comfortable. As evening approached, Margaret heard a car in the driveway. David had arrived, and with him came the uncertainty of what would happen next. She had no idea that James would linger for 2 more weeks or that during that time, she would discover things about the Harrison family that would change everything she thought she knew. The sound of David's footsteps on the stairs grew louder, and Margaret prepared herself for the most difficult conversation of her 20-year relationship with the Harrison family. David Harrison entered his father's bedroom with the confident stride of a successful attorney, but Margaret could see the shock in his eyes when he saw how frail James had become. It had been 3 months since his last visit, and the change was dramatic. "Dad?" David approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid his father might break from his presence alone. James's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his son's voice. For a moment, confusion clouded his features, then recognition dawned. "David, you came." "Of course I came, Dad. Margaret said you were sick." David pulled a chair close to the bed, something Margaret had rarely seen him do during his previous visits. Over the next few days, David surprised Margaret by staying at the house and taking an active role in his father's care. He helped with meals, sat with James during the day, and even assisted Margaret with some of the more difficult aspects of caregiving. Margaret began to see a different side of James's son, one that was perhaps hidden under years of business obligations and complicated family dynamics. On the 4th day of David's visit, while James was sleeping peacefully, David approached Margaret in the kitchen where she was preparing lunch. "Margaret, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice serious. "I had no idea how much you were doing for Dad. I thought he was exaggerating when he talked about your care in our phone calls." Margaret continued stirring the soup, unsure how to respond. "I was just doing my job, Mr. David." "No." David shook his head firmly. "This is far beyond any job description. You've been taking care of him like he was your own father. I should have been here more. I should have helped." Margaret turned to face him, seeing genuine regret in his eyes. "Your father understands that you have your own family, your own responsibilities." David sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "My own excuses, you mean? I was so busy being angry about things from the past that I forgot he was getting old and needed me." This was the first time in 20 years that David had opened up to Margaret about his relationship with his father. She sat down across from him, sensing he needed to talk. "He loves you very much," Margaret said simply. "He talks about you all the time, about how proud he is of your success, your family." "Then why does it feel like we're strangers?" David asked. "I know it's partly my fault. After Mom died, I blamed him for working so much when we were kids. I blamed him for not being there when she got sick. But sitting here now, watching him struggle to breathe, none of that seems to matter anymore." Margaret had witnessed this kind of regret before when families face the end of a loved one's life. "It's not too late to tell him how you feel." David nodded, wiping his eyes quickly. Margaret, I need to ask you something. Dad's lawyer called me yesterday. He said Dad has made some changes to his will recently. Do you know anything about that? Margaret's heart skipped a beat. This was the conversation she had been dreading. He mentioned that he had been working with Mr. Westbrook on some legal matters.
Did he tell you what kind of changes? David's lawyer instincts were showing, but his tone remained gentle. Margaret chose her words carefully. He said he wanted to make sure I was taken care of after he's gone. I don't know the details. David studied her face for a moment, then nodded.
Good. I'm glad he did that. You deserve to be provided for. This response surprised Margaret. She had expected suspicion or anger, not acceptance. You're not upset? She asked cautiously. David leaned back in his chair. Margaret, I make a very good living as a lawyer. My kids' college funds are secure, my house is paid off, and my wife and I live comfortably. Dad built his wealth through hard work, and he has every right to share it with the person who showed him love and devotion when his own son was too proud and stubborn to do the same. Margaret felt tears of relief welling up in her eyes. Thank you for understanding. Besides, David continued with a slight smile, I suspect I know my father well enough to guess that whatever he left you, he also left me more than enough to feel grateful rather than cheated. They were interrupted by the sound of James calling weakly from his bedroom. Both Margaret and David hurried upstairs to find him trying to sit up in bed. I heard voices, James said, breathing heavily from the exertion. David, are you still here? I'm here, Dad. I'm not going anywhere. David sat on the edge of the bed and took his father's hand. James looked back and forth between his son and Margaret. I'm glad you two are talking. You're the most important people in my life. Over the following week, James's condition stabilized somewhat. He was still very weak, but he was able to stay awake longer and even managed to eat small amounts of food. During this time, Margaret watched as David and his father began to rebuild their relationship. They talked about David's childhood, about Eleanor, about the business James had built. David shared stories about his own children, James's grandchildren, whom the old man rarely got to see. Margaret often found them laughing together over shared memories or sitting in comfortable silence. One afternoon, Margaret overheard David speaking to his father in a voice thick with emotion. Dad, I'm sorry I wasn't a better son. I'm sorry I let pride keep me away when you needed me. James's response was quiet but clear. You're here now. That's what matters. Margaret realized that James's illness had given the father and son a precious gift, the chance to reconcile before it was too late. She had played a role in facilitating this by maintaining the household and caring for James, but the emotional healing between them was their own work. As James's condition remained stable, David began making arrangements to extend his stay. He contacted his law firm to handle his cases remotely and asked his wife to manage things at home for a few more weeks. I want to be here, he told Margaret one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. For however long Dad has left, I want to be the son I should have been all along. Margaret smiled, feeling a deep satisfaction that went beyond her role as caregiver. She had not only helped preserve James's physical health over the years, but had also somehow helped preserve the possibility for this reconciliation. It felt like one of the most meaningful accomplishments of her life. 2 weeks after David's arrival, James had what Dr. Peterson called a good rally. His appetite returned slightly. He was more alert. And he even asked to be wheeled out to the garden to enjoy the autumn sunshine. For a few days, it seemed like he might have more time than anyone had expected. During this period, James made a request that surprised both Margaret and David. He wanted to have a family dinner, all three of them together in the dining room, with the good china and silver that Eleanor had loved. I want to feel like we're a real family, James explained from his wheelchair as Margaret set the elegant table. Margaret, you've been part of this family longer than most people stay in marriages. David, you're my son and I want us to celebrate being together. Margaret protested gently. Mr. Harrison, I should serve the dinner, not sit at the table with you. Nonsense, James said firmly, showing a flash of his old authoritative personality. Tonight you're not the housekeeper. You're family. David supported his father's wishes. Dad's right, Margaret. You've earned a place at this table. That evening, Margaret felt strange sitting in the formal dining room as an equal rather than as help. She had polished this table hundreds of times, served countless meals in this room, but had never sat down to eat here herself. James was in his best spirits in weeks. He told stories about building his business, about his early days with Eleanor, and about funny incidents from Margaret's 20 years in the house. David shared updates about his children and his law practice, and for the first time, the conversation felt natural and warm. "You know," James said during dessert, "I used to worry about what would happen to this family after Eleanor died. I thought the Harrison name would die with me, that there would be no legacy of love to pass on. But looking around this table tonight, I realize I was wrong. Love doesn't require blood. It requires choice, commitment, and care. Both of you have given me that." Margaret felt tears threatening again. Over the past weeks, she had cried more than she had in years. Tears of sadness, fear, gratitude, and now, overwhelming love for this improvised family. After dinner, David helped his father to his room while Margaret cleaned up. When David returned to the kitchen, he found her washing the fine china by hand, as she always did with Eleanor's precious dishes. "Margaret, I've been thinking about something," David said, drying the plates as she handed them to him. "After Dad passes, you'll need time to figure out what you want to do next. This house will need to be sold eventually, but there's no rush. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to make your plans." Margaret looked up in surprise. "That's very kind of you, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not an imposition. This is your home. You've made it your home for 20 years. Besides, I'll probably need help managing Dad's affairs, going through his papers, deciding what to keep and what to donate. If you're willing, I'd appreciate your help with that." Margaret nodded gratefully. The idea of having time to transition rather than being immediately displaced was an enormous relief. 3 days later, James took a turn for the worse. He developed pneumonia, and Dr. Peterson was frank about the prognosis. "This is likely what will take him," the doctor told David and Margaret quietly. "We can keep him comfortable, but his body is too weak to fight the infection." James seemed to understand what was happening. He slept most of the time now, but during his wakeful moments he was peaceful and calm. He asked Margaret to read to him from Eleanor's favorite poetry book, and he listened to David talk about his grandchildren's latest accomplishments. On what would turn out to be James's last day, he was unusually alert. He asked to speak privately with David first, then with Margaret. When it was Margaret's turn, she sat beside his bed and took his frail hand in hers. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I need you to know that you saved my life after Eleanor died. Not just physically, but emotionally. You gave me reason to keep living." "Mr. Harrison, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I've left you enough money to live comfortably. But more than that, I've left you with the knowledge that you are deeply loved. Don't ever forget that." Margaret squeezed his hand. "I love you too. You and Mrs. Eleanor gave my life meaning." James smiled weakly. "Take care of David for me. He's a good man, but he'll need time to grieve. Help him understand that I forgave him long ago for staying away. Help him forgive himself." That evening, James Harrison passed away peacefully in his sleep, with Margaret and David sitting on either side of his bed. Margaret held one of his hands while David held the other, and together they said goodbye to the man who had brought them together as an unlikely family. The days that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, visitors, and paperwork. David proved to be as considerate in grief as he had been during his father's final weeks. He consulted Margaret on every decision, from the flowers for the service to the music that would be played. The funeral was well attended, with business associates, longtime friends, and neighbors filling the church. Margaret sat in the front row next to David and his family, clearly identified as someone important to James Harrison rather than just his employee. During the reception at the house after the service, Margaret overheard several people asking David about her role in his father's life. Each time, David spoke about her with respect and gratitude, describing her as the woman who made my father's final years meaningful and comfortable. As the last guests left that evening, Margaret and David sat in the living room, exhausted but oddly at peace. He would have been happy with today, David said. Everything was exactly as he would have wanted it. Margaret nodded, looking around the room that had been her world for 2 decades. Tomorrow everything would begin to change, but tonight, she felt surrounded by love and memories that would sustain her through whatever came next. The reading of James Harrison's will took place 1 week after the funeral in the offices of Westbrook Sullivan and Associates. Margaret felt nervous as she sat in the polished conference room. Despite David's reassurances that everything would be handled fairly, Mr. Westbrook, a distinguished man in his 70s who had handled the Harrison family's legal affairs for decades, began with the standard legal language before moving to the specific bequests. To my son David Harrison, I leave the family home and all its contents, my investment portfolio, and the remainder of my business assets, representing approximately 80% of my estate, Mr. Westbrook read in his formal tone. David nodded, unsurprised by this provision. To Margaret Chen, who has been more than an employee and has shown me devotion beyond what any employer could expect or deserve, I leave the sum of $400,000, to be paid immediately upon my death without conditions or restrictions. Margaret gasped audibly. $400,000 was more money than she had ever imagined having. It was enough to buy a small house, live comfortably for the rest of her life, and still have something left over for emergencies. David reached over and squeezed her hand. Dad wanted to make sure you'd never have to worry about money again. Mr. Westbrook continued. Additionally, there is a letter that Mr. Harrison specifically requested be read aloud to both beneficiaries. The lawyer opened a sealed envelope and began to read in James's own words. Written in his distinctive handwriting, David, my son, I hope that by the time you hear this letter, we have had the chance to rebuild our relationship. I forgive you for staying away, and I hope you can forgive an old man for not being the father you needed when you were young. You are a good man, and I am proud of the life you have built. Margaret saw tears in David's eyes as his father's words reached him from beyond the grave. The letter continued. Margaret, my dear friend, you have been the daughter I never had and the companion who made my final years bearable. The money I leave you is not charity. It is recognition of value given and love shared. You earned every penny through your kindness, sacrifice, and dedication. Mr. Westbrook paused, then read the final paragraph. To both of you, I leave the most important thing I own, the knowledge that love makes a family, not just blood. Take care of each other. When the lawyer finished reading, the room was silent except for the quiet sounds of Margaret and David both trying to compose themselves. There are some additional papers to sign, Mr. Westbrook said gently, but the main provisions are clear and uncomplicated. Margaret, your inheritance will be transferred to an account of your choosing within the next few days. As they left the lawyer's office, Margaret felt overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. For 20 years, she had lived paycheck to paycheck, saving what she could but never accumulating substantial wealth. Now suddenly she was financially independent. How are you feeling? David asked as they drove back to the house. Confused, Margaret admitted. Grateful but confused. I don't know what to do with myself now. David was quiet for a moment. You know, you don't have to decide everything immediately. Dad was right, this house is going to take time to deal with. There are 40 years' worth of belongings to sort through, business papers to organize, and decisions to make about what to keep and what to donate. If you're willing, I could really use your help. Margaret felt a wave of relief. The idea of immediately leaving the only home she had known for 2 decades felt frightening. Having a purpose and a gradual transition sounded much more manageable. I'd be happy to help, she said, but I insist on paying rent if I'm staying in the house. David shook his head. Absolutely not. You'd be doing me a favor. Besides, Dad specifically wanted you to feel welcome here for as long as you needed. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and David began the enormous task of going through James's possessions. They worked together in his study, sorting business documents, personal papers, and memorabilia from his decades as a successful businessman. Margaret found herself sharing stories about items they discovered, the pen James had used to sign his biggest shipping contract, the photograph of him and Eleanor at their 25th wedding anniversary party, the small notebook where he had jotted down ideas for expanding his business. You know Dad's life better than I do, David said one afternoon as they went through a box of old letters. These stories you're telling me, I never heard most of them. Your father was a private man in some ways, Margaret replied. But he loved talking about the past, especially about your mother and about building the business. I think he was lonely after she died and needed someone to listen. They also found several items that James had specifically marked for Margaret, Eleanor's jewelry box, some first edition books, and a small painting that had hung in the bedroom Margaret had occupied for 20 years. Dad noted that these should go to you, David said, showing her the list in James's handwriting. He thought about this very carefully. As winter turned to spring, Margaret began to feel ready to make plans for her future. The inheritance money was safely in her bank account, earning interest, and she had started looking at small houses in nearby neighborhoods. I think I'm ready to find my own place, she told David one evening as they finished cataloging the last box of papers in James's study. David looked up from the documents he was reviewing. Are you sure? There's no pressure from my end. I'm sure, Margaret said. It's time. Your father gave me the gift of independence, and I think I'm finally ready to use it. David nodded understandingly. I'm going to miss having you here. It's been nice working together, sharing memories of Dad. We'll stay in touch, Margaret assured him. After everything we've been through together, you're family now. That weekend, Margaret found a small but charming house just 10 minutes away from the Harrison mansion. It had 2 bedrooms, a tiny garden where she could grow vegetables, and large windows that would let in plenty of natural light. The asking price was well within her budget, leaving her with substantial savings for the future. As she stood in the empty living room of what would soon be her first home, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude. James Harrison had given her more than money. He had given her the freedom to choose her own future for the first time in her adult life. 6 months after moving into her new home, Margaret had settled into a routine that felt both familiar and wonderfully different from her decades of caregiving. She woke each morning in her own bedroom, made coffee in her own kitchen, and tended to her small garden before deciding how to spend her day. The house had become a reflection of her personality in ways the Harrison mansion never could. She had chosen comfortable furniture, hung photographs of her travels with Eleanor and James, and filled the rooms with plants and books. For the first time in her adult life, every decision about her living space was entirely her own. David visited regularly, often bringing his wife Linda and their teenage children, Michael and Sarah. Margaret had become like a grandmother to the kids, something that brought unexpected joy to her life. She taught Sarah how to bake Eleanor's famous chocolate chip cookies and listened to Michael practice his violin pieces. You know, Linda told Margaret during one of these visits, the kids talk about you all the time. You've become such an important part of their lives. Margaret felt touched by this connection to the next generation of Harrisons. It was a continuation of the family bonds that had sustained her for so many years. 3 months after settling into her new life, Margaret received an unexpected phone call from David. His voice sounded different, excited, but also nervous. Margaret, I need to talk to you about something important. Can I come over? Within an hour, David was sitting in Margaret's cozy living room, holding a cup of tea and looking more serious than she had seen him since his father's funeral. Margaret, I've been thinking about Dad's legacy and about everything you taught me during his final weeks. You showed me what real devotion looks like, what it means to care for someone without expecting anything in return. Margaret waited, sensing that David had something specific on his mind. I want to start a foundation, David continued, a foundation that provides support and recognition for caregivers like you, people who dedicate their lives to caring for elderly or disabled family members and employers. I want to call it the Harrison Foundation for Caregiving Excellence. Margaret set down her teacup, surprised by this unexpected announcement. I've been working with lawyers and accountants to set it up, David explained. I want to use a significant portion of my inheritance from Dad to fund scholarships for caregiver training, provide financial assistance to people who sacrifice their careers to care for loved ones, and create an annual award recognizing outstanding caregivers. David, that's a wonderful idea, but why are you telling me this? David leaned forward, his expression earnest. Because I want you to run it. I want you to be the executive director of the foundation. Margaret stared at him, speechless. The idea of running a foundation, of having a career with purpose and meaning, had never occurred to her. Think about it, David continued. You understand caregiving from the inside. You know what caregivers need, what challenges they face, what kind of support would make the biggest difference. You have 20 years of experience, and you have the compassion and wisdom to make real change in people's lives. Margaret's mind raced with possibilities and concerns. David, I don't have experience running an organization. I don't know anything about foundations or grants or... You can learn those things, David interrupted. What you can't learn is the heart you bring to caregiving. That's what this foundation needs most. They talked for hours about David's vision for the foundation. He had already identified office space, hired an accountant, and consulted with experts in nonprofit management. He had thought through every detail except the most important one, finding someone who truly understood the mission. "I need some time to think about this," Margaret said finally. "Of course, take all the time you need. But Margaret, Dad always said you had untapped potential. Maybe this is your chance to discover what that potential could become." Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret found herself unable to think about anything else. The idea of using her experience to help other caregivers felt like a natural extension of the work that had defined her adult life. But it also represented a completely new challenge at a stage in life when most people were thinking about slowing down. She called David with her decision on a sunny Tuesday morning. "Yes," she said simply when he answered the phone. "I want to do this. I want to run the foundation." The next 6 months were a whirlwind of learning and growth. Margaret threw herself into understanding nonprofit management, grant writing, and program development. David connected her with experienced foundation directors who became mentors, and she attended workshops on everything from budget management to public speaking. The Harrison Foundation for Caregiving Excellence officially launched 1 year after James Harrison's death. The timing felt meaningful, a way of honoring his memory while creating something positive for the future. At the launch event, held in a hotel ballroom filled with caregivers, social workers, and community leaders, Margaret stood at the podium to give her first public speech as executive director. "1 year ago, I was a private caregiver who had never imagined having a different life," she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Today, I stand before you as someone who has learned that it's never too late to discover new purpose." She talked about James Harrison's legacy, about the dignity of caregiving work, and about the Foundation's mission to support and celebrate people who dedicate their lives to caring for others. As she spoke, Margaret saw David in the audience smiling with pride. Near him sat Linda and their children, and scattered throughout the room were other people whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work in just its first few months of operation. "Caregiving is not just a job," Margaret concluded. "It's a calling that requires skill, compassion, and incredible personal sacrifice. Our goal is to ensure that caregivers receive the recognition, support, and resources they deserve." The applause was warm and sustained. As Margaret left the podium, she felt James Harrison's presence in a way that seemed almost tangible. She had spent 20 years caring for him, never imagining that this devotion would lead to a career that could impact thousands of other caregivers. 6 months later, the Foundation had awarded its first scholarships, provided emergency financial assistance to dozens of families, and established partnerships with nursing schools and community colleges to improve caregiver training programs. Margaret's small house had become a hub of activity, with Foundation staff members stopping by for meetings and her dining room table, often covered with grant applications and program proposals. She had found her life's work at an age when many people consider their productive years to be over. One evening, as Margaret sat in her garden watching the sunset, her phone rang. It was David, calling with news about the Foundation's latest grant approval. "Margaret, we just received funding for the respite care program. We can start providing temporary relief for family caregivers next month." Margaret smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from meaningful work. "James would be so proud of what we've built." "He would be proud of what you've built," David corrected. "This foundation is successful because of your vision and dedication." As Margaret ended the call and returned to watching the sunset, she reflected on the unexpected journey her life had taken. She had given James Harrison 20 years of devoted care, expecting nothing more than a modest salary and a place to belong. In return, he had given her financial security, a loving family relationship with his son, and indirectly, a new career that allowed her to multiply her impact on the world. The quiet woman who had once thought her only purpose was caring for one elderly man had discovered that her true calling was caring for an entire community of caregivers. It was a legacy that would outlive them all, and a reminder that love and service, when given freely, always return in ways more beautiful than we could ever imagine.